The boardroom was suffocating in silence. 100 eyes darted toward me, some curious, some hostile, all waiting for me to stumble. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the edges of the podium, the polished mahogany cool against my sweaty palms. I had just finished speaking, my voice quivering but steady enough to deliver a false eulogy for the man we all secretly despised. Our late CEO, Gerald Stanton. I called him a visionary, a mentor, even a guiding light. Words that made bile rise in my throat. For a moment, the silence hung like a fog. The shareholders shifted in their expensive leather chairs. My colleagues stared down at their hands. No one wanted to meet my eyes after what I'd just done. And then the doors slammed open. A tall man in a charcoal suit marched in, his briefcase clicking sharply with every step against the marble floor. His voice cut through the air like a verdict. "Congratulations, Ms. Megan Turner. You passed Gerald Stanton's final test." The room gasped. Shareholders stiffened. My blood ran cold. The lawyer placed a thick envelope on the polished table. He looked directly at me, his expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses. Inside, "This contract is the truth about Gerald Stanton's legacy, and your role in it." My heart pounded. I thought surviving Gerald's cruelty had been my greatest battle. But I was wrong. The real trial was only beginning. I never meant to work for Gerald Stanton for 10 years. No one did. People came to Stanton Enterprises with bright eyes and ambition, only to leave broken or bitter within months. Yet, somehow, I stayed. "Megan, my office, now!" His voice always had that edge, like sandpaper wrapped in silk. That particular Tuesday morning, I'd prepared the quarterly operations report he'd requested. 37 pages of meticulously researched data, charts that told the story of our successes, and transparent analysis of our failures. 3 weeks of late nights and missed dinners with my sister. I smoothed my pencil skirt, tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, and walked the Green Mile to his corner office overlooking Manhattan. "Close the door," he said without looking up from his computer. The morning light caught the silver in his perfectly coiffed hair. At 62, Gerald Stanton was still imposing, 6'2", with shoulders that filled out his custom suits and a jawline that photographers loved. I stood silently, clutching my presentation folder. 5 minutes passed while he ignored me, a power move I'd grown accustomed to. "This report," he finally said, holding up my work. "Tell me why I shouldn't throw it in the trash." "It contains all the data you requested, sir, including the projections for—" He cut me off, standing suddenly. "It's useless, Megan, like most of what you do." The familiar knot formed in my stomach. "I'd be happy to revise any sections that—" "The board meeting is in 40 minutes. He tossed the folder onto the floor, papers spilling across the polished hardwood. "You'll present this garbage, and when it fails to impress them, perhaps you'll finally understand your limitations." I knelt to gather the scattered pages, keeping my face carefully neutral. This was the game. Show emotion, and he won. Show weakness, and you were finished. "Yes, sir," I said evenly. The boardroom that day was packed with executives and major shareholders. I stood at the front, Gerald seated directly to my right, watching me like a hawk eyeing wounded prey. "Ms. Turner will present the quarterly operations report," he announced with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Our little secretary who thinks she's a strategist." Laughter rippled through the room, some genuine, some uncomfortable. I was 30 years old with an MBA from Columbia, but in Gerald's world, I would always be the little secretary. I began my presentation, and for 15 minutes I owned that room. The numbers were solid. My delivery was flawless. Some of the board members were nodding along, impressed despite themselves. Then Gerald cleared his throat. "Perhaps, Ms. Turner, you'd like to explain why these projections contradict the financial department's assessment?" My heart sank. There was no contradiction. I'd checked with finance twice. But it didn't matter. Gerald was setting me up to fail, as he always did. "I'm not seeing the contradiction you're referring to, Mr. Stanton," I replied carefully. "Of course you don't," he said with exaggerated patience. "That's why you're standing there while I'm sitting here." He turned to the board. "This is what happens when we promote beyond competence, gentlemen." The room fell silent. I stood there, my cheeks burning, as Gerald systematically dismantled my presentation point by point, inventing flaws where none existed. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. Later that day, I found Olivia Myers, the only genuine friend I had at Stanton Enterprises, waiting by my desk with a cup of coffee. "I heard what happened," she said softly, her dark eyes sympathetic. At 45, Olivia had survived at the company longer than most, keeping her head down in the marketing department. Why do you stay, Meg? You could work anywhere. I sank into my chair, accepting the coffee gratefully. Sometimes I don't know. But that wasn't entirely true. I stayed for the people, the ones like Karen Mitchell in HR who secretly helped employees navigate Stanton's arbitrary firings. Or Anthony Delgado, who despite his ambition made sure the junior staff got credit for their work when Gerald wasn't looking. I stayed because someone needed to be a buffer between Gerald and the people who couldn't afford to lose their jobs. Did you hear what he did to old Frank? Olivia whispered, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. Frank Williams had been the building's janitor for 25 years, a gentle, grandfatherly figure who knew everyone's name and kept candy in his pockets for the stressed-out assistants. What happened? I asked, though the sick feeling in my stomach told me it wouldn't be good. Gerald was hosting those investors from Dubai. Frank was serving coffee, his hands shaking a bit. You know how arthritis has been getting to him. He dropped a cup. Just one cup. Olivia's voice cracked. Gerald fired him on the spot, in front of everyone, called him useless, said it was time to put him out to pasture. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar rage that always simmered just beneath the surface. Where is Frank now? Clearing out his locker. 25 years, Megan? The man has grandchildren in college he's helping support. I stood up so quickly my chair rolled back and hit the wall. I'll be right back. I found Frank in the maintenance room, slowly, placing his few belongings into a cardboard box. His eyes were red-rimmed, his weathered hands trembling worse than usual. Ms. Turner, he said, attempting a smile that broke my heart. Don't you worry about me now. I've had a good run. This isn't right, Frank. I'll talk to Gerald. There's a retirement package you should be entitled to, at the very least. Frank shook his head. Mr. Stanton was very clear. Said I'm lucky he doesn't bill me for the broken china. He patted my hand. Some battles you can't win, Ms. Turner. I learned that in Vietnam. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my modest one-bedroom apartment, wondering why I continued to endure Gerald Stanton's tyranny. I could leave. I should leave. But every time I got close to walking away, I thought of the Franks and Karens and Olivias who would be left unprotected. And so I stayed year after year, building an armor of efficiency and quiet competence that even Gerald Stanton couldn't completely dismiss. I never imagined his death would be the event that finally shattered that armor. The news came on a rainy Monday morning. I was reviewing contracts when my phone buzzed with a text from Olivia. Emergency all staff in the main conference room. Now. When I arrived, the tension in the air was palpable. Karen Mitchell from HR stood at the front, her usual composed demeanor fractured by what looked like shock. I have difficult news, she began, her voice unsteady. Gerald Stanton passed away last night. A heart attack. The room fell silent. Not the respectful silence of grief, but the stunned quiet of people who don't know how to react. Should we mourn the man who had tormented us? Were we allowed to feel relief? Anthony Delgado, VP of Business Development and Gerald's most ambitious lieutenant, was the first to speak. This is a tremendous loss for the company, he said, his voice carrying just the right note of sorrow. But I caught the calculation in his eyes. Gerald's death had created a vacuum, and Anthony was already positioning himself to fill it. Karen continued, the board has called an emergency meeting for tomorrow. In the meantime, all operations will continue as normal. She paused. There will also be a memorial service here at the office on Thursday. The shareholders feel it's important to honor Mr. Stanton's legacy. Legacy. The word hung in the air like a bad joke. As people filed out of the conference room, I noticed the varied reactions. Some younger employees looked openly relieved. Veterans like Olivia seemed cautiously hopeful. Anthony was already on his phone, no doubt making alliances. Well, that happened, Olivia said, falling into step beside me as we headed back to our offices. Heart attack, huh? I always figured his, heart was too small to fail. Olivia, I warned, though I couldn't help the small smile that tugged at my lips. What? The man was a monster, Meg. You know it better than anyone. She lowered her voice. Do you think things might actually change now? I wanted to share her optimism, but 10 years under Gerald had taught me caution. Let's wait and see who takes his place before we celebrate. The next 2 days passed in a blur of uncertainty. Work continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. People spoke a little louder, laughed a little more freely. Gerald's office remained closed, a silent shrine to the tyrant who would never return. Thursday arrived, the day of the memorial. The main conference room had been transformed with flowers and a large portrait of Gerald looking imperious in his best suit. Shareholders, board members, and employees filed in, filling the seats. I sat between Olivia and Karen, watching as Anthony Delgado worked the room, shaking hands with board members, his expression appropriately solemn. $5 says Anthony uses this to announce himself as the new CEO, Olivia whispered. You're terrible, I whispered back, but we both knew she wasn't wrong. The board chairman, Walter Reynolds, took the podium first. An elderly man with a shock of white hair, he'd been Gerald's friend for decades. Gerald Stanton was a visionary, he began, and I had to stop myself from rolling my eyes. His leadership transformed a small family business into a global enterprise. Today, we honor not just the man, but his legacy. One by one, board members stood to offer platitudes about Gerald, his business acumen, his tough but fair leadership, his philanthropy, which had been minimal and always calculated for tax benefits. None of them mentioned his cruelty, his pettiness, or the trail of broken careers he'd left in his wake. Then Walter asked if any employees would like to speak. The silence that followed was deafening. Hundreds of people who had worked under Gerald Stanton for years, and not one was willing to stand and honor him. The shareholders shifted uncomfortably. Walter cleared his throat, looking embarrassed. Surely someone has a memory to share, he prompted. More silence. I could feel the collective resistance, the unspoken refusal to whitewash the truth of who Gerald had been. Anthony finally stood, always the opportunist. I would be honored to say a few words about my mentor, but something in me snapped. The idea of Anthony using this moment to curry favor, painting Gerald as a saint when we all knew the truth, it was too much. Before I could think better of it, I found myself standing. I'll speak, I said, my voice carrying across the quiet room. Olivia grabbed my wrist. Meg, what are you doing? She hissed. I wasn't entirely sure, but I moved toward the podium anyway, feeling every eye on me. As I took my place, looking out at the sea of faces, some confused, some curious, some already judging, I realized I stood at a crossroads. I could tell the truth about Gerald Stanton and the toxic culture he'd created, or I could do what everyone expected, offer empty praise for a man who deserved none. I took a deep, breath and chose a third path. Gerald Stanton, I began, was a complex man. And then I lied. Beautifully, eloquently, convincingly. I spoke of his visionary leadership, his commitment to excellence, his unwavering standards. I fabricated anecdotes of his mentorship, his guidance, his supposed belief in developing talent. Each word tasted like ash in my mouth, but I continued painting a portrait of a man who had never existed. A Gerald Stanton who cared about his employees, who built rather than destroyed, who inspired rather than terrorized. When I finished, the room was silent again, but differently now. There was confusion in the eyes of my colleagues who couldn't believe what they'd just heard from me of all people. There was relief from the shareholders who had gotten the, sanitized memorial they wanted. And there was something like respect from the board members, who perhaps saw in me a company player who understood the value of discretion and image management. I returned to my seat, feeling hollow inside. What the hell was that? Olivia whispered, genuine confusion in her eyes. I couldn't answer her. I wasn't sure myself. That's when the doors slammed open, and Thomas Green, Gerald's personal attorney, strode in with his briefcase. Congratulations, Ms. Megan Turner, he announced to the stunned room. You passed Gerald Stanton's final test. And just like that, everything changed. Thomas Green's words hung in the air, a bombshell that left the room paralyzed. My heart hammered against my ribs as he approached the podium, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor in a steady rhythm that seemed to match my pulse. For those who don't know me, he continued, his voice crisp and authoritative, I'm Thomas Green, Mr. Stanton's personal attorney for the past 20 years. He placed his briefcase on the podium and clicked it open with practiced efficiency. From my seat, I could see Anthony Delgado's face darkening. The board. Members leaned forward, their expressions ranging from confusion to alarm. Walter Reynolds, the chairman, half rose from his chair. Mr. Green, this is highly irregular. We weren't informed of any test. Green smiled thinly. That was rather the point, Mr. Reynolds. He withdrew a thick manila envelope from his briefcase and held it up. Mr. Stanton was very specific about the parameters of, his final wishes. My mouth had gone dry. I felt Olivia's hand slip into mine, squeezing tightly. Gerald Stanton, Green continued, anticipated his own passing would be met with, shall we say, less than genuine grief. A murmur rippled through the room. He created a private addendum to his will and to the company bylaws, fully legal and binding, I assure you, that contained what he called the eulogy clause. Green's eyes found mine in the crowd. The clause stipulated that if no employee voluntarily spoke in his defense at his memorial, his controlling shares of Stanton Enterprises would be immediately sold to the highest bidder among his competitors. Gasps echoed through the room. The implications were clear to everyone. Such a sale would likely mean the dismantling of the company. Thousands of jobs lost, careers destroyed. However, Green continued, if an employee did rise to speak, without coercion or foreknowledge of this clause, that person would be named the beneficiary of Gerald Stanton's private trust and awarded his controlling interest in the company. The room erupted. Anthony Delgado shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger. This is preposterous, he shouted. A junior manager inheriting control of $1 billion company? It's absurd. Ms. Turner is hardly junior, Green corrected coolly. She has been with the company for 10 years and holds an executive position in operations management. Walter Reynolds was shaking his head. This can't be legal. The board would never. The board approved these bylaws 5 years ago, Mr. Reynolds. Green's smile was razor-sharp. Page 247, subsection C, if you'd care to check. You all signed off on it without reading the fine print. Exactly as Gerald predicted you would. I felt lightheaded, disconnected from my body. This couldn't be happening. Gerald Stanton, who had belittled me at every opportunity, who had systematically undermined my confidence and career for a decade, had just handed me control of his empire? Green approached me, extending the envelope. Ms. Turner, inside you'll find the contract detailing your new position, the transfer of shares, and Mr. Stanton's personal letter to you. I suggest you review it carefully with your own counsel. I took the envelope with numb fingers. Its weight felt impossible, as though it contained not just paper, but the burden of 1,000 employees' futures. This is a setup, Anthony snarled, pushing through the crowd toward me. She knew about this. Why else would she suddenly speak up for a man she clearly despised? Green raised an eyebrow. Did you know about this clause, Ms. Turner? No, I said, finding my voice at last. I had no idea. Then why? Anthony demanded, his face inches from mine now. Why defend him when no one else would? When you of all people knew what he was really like? It was a question I couldn't fully answer, not even to myself. Why had I stood up? Why had I painted a false portrait of a man I'd secretly hated for years? Someone had to say something, I said quietly. The silence was wrong. Green nodded, as if this answer confirmed something for him. Mr. Stanton said you might say that. He addressed the room at large. The board will convene tomorrow morning to formalize Ms. Turner's position. Until then, this meeting is adjourned. As people began filing out, some shocked, some angry, many whispering frantically, Olivia stayed beside me, her expression stunned. Meg, she breathed, you just inherited $1 billion company because you told some nice lies about the boss from hell. This can't be real, I whispered, but the weight of the envelope in my hands told me otherwise. I sat alone in my apartment that night. The contents of Gerald's envelope spread across my coffee table. The legal documents confirmed everything Green had said. Gerald's controlling shares, 51% of the company, now belonged to me. The board could advise, but they couldn't overrule me. But it was the handwritten letter that truly shook me. Gerald's familiar, aggressive scrawl filled the expensive stationery. To the one who defends me. If you're reading this, I'm dead, and you've done what I expected. Spoken well of me when no one else would. Don't mistake this for sentiment. I'm not rewarding you for liking me. I never cared if I was liked. I'm rewarding you for having the strength I lacked, the ability to lead even in a room of enemies, to stand alone when it would be easier to sit silent. I've watched you for years. While others cowered or quit, you endured. You protected those beneath you. You absorbed the worst of me so others wouldn't have to. You fought back in small ways I was meant to overlook but never did. Do with my empire what I could not. Make it respected. Fear kept it functioning. Perhaps you can find a better way. Don't prove me wrong. Gerald Stanton. I read the letter 3 times, tears blurring my vision by the 3rd reading. Not tears of gratitude or grief, but of rage and confusion. After 10 years of psychological torture, Gerald's final act was to frame his cruelty as some twisted character test I'd supposedly passed. My phone, had been ringing nonstop. Calls from board members, from employees seeking reassurance, from Anthony making thinly veiled threats. I ignored them all. Instead, I called the one person who had never abandoned me throughout the Gerald years, my sister Rachel. "I saw the news," she said when she picked up. "It's all over the business channels. Unknown manager inherits Stanton Empire. Are you okay?" "I don't know," I admitted. "It doesn't make sense, Rachel. Why me? Why not Anthony or one of the other executives he actually seemed to tolerate? Because they're just like him," Rachel said simply. And maybe, deep down, Gerald hated who he was. I laughed bitterly. Gerald Stanton didn't have that kind of self-awareness. "Maybe not consciously," she said, "but his actions speak louder than whatever psychological garbage was going on in his head. He chose you, Meg. The question is, what are you going to do with that choice?" I looked down at the contract, at the power it represented. Power I'd never sought, never imagined holding. "I don't know if I can do this," I whispered. "Running a company this size, people will fight me at every turn. Anthony's already positioning to challenge the will." "So what?" Rachel's voice was firm. "You survived Gerald Stanton for 10 years. You can survive this. And maybe, just maybe, you can turn that place into something better than it was under him." After we hung up, I sat staring at Gerald's letter until the words blurred together. Outside my window, Manhattan glittered, indifferent to my dilemma. Tomorrow, I would have to walk into Stanton Enterprises as its new owner. The thought was terrifying. But for the first time in a decade, I would walk in without Gerald's shadow looming over me, without his voice cutting me down, without his presence poisoning the air. That, at least, was something to hold on to. The moment I stepped through the lobby doors of Stanton Enterprises the following morning, I knew something. Fundamental had shifted. Security guards who had barely acknowledged my existence for years now straightened as I passed, offering respectful nods. The receptionist, who'd always been pleasant but distant, practically leapt to her feet. "Good morning, Ms. Turner. The board is waiting for you in the main conference room." I nodded, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. I'd dressed carefully. That morning, a charcoal pantsuit that was professional without being flashy, sensible heels, minimal jewelry. I'd pulled my hair back into a sleek bun, applied just enough makeup to look polished but not glamorous. The elevator ride to the executive floor was surreal. Employees who found themselves sharing the car with me stared openly before averting their eyes, whispering the moment I stepped out. News traveled fast in corporate America, but Gerald's bombshell had achieved something close to light speed. Thomas Green waited outside the conference room, looking exactly as he had yesterday in his impeccable suit. "Ms. Turner," he greeted me, "before you go in, you should know that Mr. Delgado has spent the night calling board members. He's challenging the validity of the clause." Of course he was. Anthony had been Gerald's heir apparent for years, at least in his own mind. "Is the challenge valid?" I asked, keeping my voice level. Green's thin smile returned. "Not remotely. Gerald Stanton may have been many things, but legally careless wasn't one of them. The clause is ironclad." I took a deep breath. "Then let's get this over with." The boardroom fell silent as I entered, Green at my shoulder. 12 pairs of eyes tracked my movement to the chair at the head of the table, Gerald's chair. I hesitated for just a moment before taking my seat. Walter Reynolds cleared his throat. "Ms. Turner, while we appreciate your unexpected circumstances, the board has concerns about this transition." "Concerns is putting it mildly," Anthony cut in. He hadn't bothered to disguise his hostility. "This is a sophisticated global enterprise, not a corner store. It requires experienced leadership." I met his gaze steadily. "I've been managing the operational backbone of this company for 5 years, Mr. Delgado. I'm familiar with how sophisticated enterprises function." "Managing reports isn't the same as setting vision," he countered. "Gerald mentored me. He shared his strategies, his connections, and yet he didn't choose you," I said quietly. The words landed like a slap. Anthony's face flushed dark red, but before he could respond, Green intervened. "Perhaps we could focus on the legal formalities," he suggested smoothly. "There are documents requiring signatures, announcements to prepare." For the next hour, I signed paperwork, listened to legal advisories, and nodded through explanations of responsibilities I was now expected to shoulder. Throughout, I could feel Anthony's glare boring into me, the whispered conversations between board members who clearly saw me as an interloper. When we finally adjourned, Walter Reynolds held me back with a hand on my arm. "A word of advice, Ms. Turner," he said once we were alone. Gerald may have gifted you control, but running this company requires alliances. Anthony has deep connections with our major clients. The board has decades of combined experience. Don't make enemies where you could make allies. His tone was friendly, paternal even, but I recognized the implicit threat. Play by our rules, or we'll make your life impossible. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Reynolds, I replied, carefully. I look forward to working with everyone to ensure Stanton Enterprises continues to thrive. He seemed satisfied with my diplomatic answer and nodded before leaving me alone in the massive boardroom. I allowed myself a moment of stillness, absorbing the reality of my new position. The polished table stretched before me like a mahogany sea, the floor-to-ceiling windows framing a view of the city Gerald had once proudly claimed he owned a piece of. Now, absurdly, that piece belonged to me. My reflection in the window looked small, uncertain. What would I do with this power I'd never wanted? How would I navigate the sharks already circling, sensing blood in the water? I was still standing there when Olivia found me. There she is, the new queen of the castle, she said, closing the door behind her. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Just had my first board meeting, I said. Anthony's out for blood. No surprise there. He's been telling anyone who'll listen that you somehow engineered this whole thing. She perched on the edge of the table. The office is buzzing. Half the people think you're some kind of genius who played the long game. The other half think you just got lucky. What do you think? I asked. Olivia studied me for a moment. I think Gerald Stanton was playing chess while the rest of us were playing checkers. The question is why he put you in this position. What did he expect you to do with it? It was the same question I'd been asking myself since last night. Gerald hadn't given me this power out of kindness or recognition of my abilities. He'd had some purpose, some expectation. I don't know, I admitted, but I'm not going to let him control me from the grave. That's my girl, Olivia smiled. So what's your first move as the big boss? Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from Karen in HR. Anthony just fired Frank Williams' daughter from accounting, says it was performance issues. Everyone knows it's because of you. My stomach dropped. Frank's daughter Lisa had worked in accounting for years without issue. This was Anthony's first salvo, punishing those connected to me to demonstrate his continued power. I showed the text to Olivia, whose expression hardened. So that's how he wants to play it, she said. What are you going to do? I stood up straighter, decision made. I'm going to rehire Lisa Williams. And then I'm going to rehire her father with full retirement benefits. I headed for the door, a plan forming. And then I'm going to make it very clear that the era of ruling through fear is over. Olivia's smile was fierce. Now that sounds like a CEO I could follow. As I walked through the executive floor toward what was now my office, Gerald's former sanctuary, I felt eyes following me, measuring me, judging whether I would sink or swim. The weight of expectations pressed down, but with it came something unexpected, a sense of purpose. Gerald Stanton had ruled through fear and manipulation. Perhaps he'd chosen me because he expected me to continue his legacy of cruelty. Or perhaps, as Rachel suggested, he'd seen something in me that he lacked in himself. Either way, I was about to disappoint anyone who expected me to be Gerald 2.0. Because while I might have inherited his company, I refused to inherit his methods. Gerald's office, my office now, was exactly as he'd left it. Imposing mahogany desk positioned to make visitors feel small. Awards and trophies displayed like weapons. The wall of windows offering a god's eye view of Manhattan. Even the air smelled like him. Expensive cologne and intimidation. I walked the perimeter slowly, taking inventory of the space that had been the epicenter of so much fear. Family photos were noticeably absent. No personal touches betrayed the man behind the power. It was a stage set designed for a single purpose: dominance. My first instinct was to call maintenance and have everything removed. To exorcise Gerald's ghost from these walls. But that would have to wait. I had more pressing concerns. I picked up the phone and dialed HR. Karen, it's Megan. I need Lisa Williams in my office immediately. And I want her father here too. Today. Lisa already cleared out her desk, Karen said, her voice cautious. Anthony had security escort her out. Call her. Tell her she's not fired and never was. I want both Williams here at 2 o'clock. I paused. And Karen? Schedule a company-wide meeting for 4 today. Mandatory attendance. Yes, Ms. Turner. The formality in her voice made me wince. It's still just Megan, Karen. A hesitation then softer. Things are changing fast around here, Megan. People are choosing sides. Be careful. After hanging up, I turned to the massive desk. Gerald's laptop sat closed in the center, like a totem. I opened it, expecting to need IT to bypass his password, but to my surprise, a sticky note with the credentials was attached to the screen. Gerald had planned for my inheritance down to the smallest detail. I logged in and began scanning files, emails, meeting minutes, trying to get a crash course in the responsibilities I'd just assumed. The learning curve was vertical. Stanton Enterprises had operations in 12 countries, partnerships with dozens of Fortune 500 companies, and nearly 5,000 employees globally. And then I found it, a folder labeled simply Succession. Inside was a detailed breakdown of the company's vulnerabilities, strategic challenges, and a brutally honest assessment of every executive and board member. Anthony Delgado. Ambitious. Competent. Zero loyalty except to himself. Will attempt to undermine any successor who isn't him. Most dangerous when cornered. Walter Reynolds. Old guard. Risk-averse. Controls 5 board votes through long-standing alliances. Useful as a stabilizing force, but will resist necessary change. The assessments continued, laying bare the power structure of Stanton Enterprises with clinical precision. Gerald had mapped the battlefield for me, identifying allies and enemies before I even knew I'd be fighting this war. The last file in the folder was different. A video file labeled with yesterday's date. My hand hovered over the mouse, heart pounding. A message from beyond the grave. I clicked play. Gerald's face filled the screen, recorded in this very office. He looked thinner than I remembered, his trademark confidence tinged with something I'd never seen in him before. Fatigue, perhaps, or resignation. If you're watching this, 2 things are true. He began without preamble. I'm dead. And you spoke at my memorial when no one else would. Congratulations, Megan. You've inherited a viper's nest. I flinched at hearing my name, so he had anticipated it would be me all along. Don't look so surprised, Gerald continued, as if he could see my reaction. You were the obvious choice. The only one who never broke, never ran, never compromised, despite everything I threw at you. He leaned forward, his steel gray eyes intense even through the screen. Stanton Enterprises is at a crossroads. The methods that built this company won't sustain it. The board is complacent, the executives are sharks, and the culture is toxic. I created all of that. A pause. It worked until it didn't. He sat back and for a moment looked every one of his 62 years. You have 72 hours before Anthony makes his move. He won't accept defeat gracefully. Be ready. The video ended abruptly, leaving me staring at a black screen, my reflection pale and wide-eyed. 72 hours. The countdown had started yesterday. I was still processing Gerald's warning when my assistant, Gerald's former assistant, now mine, announced that Lisa and Frank Williams had arrived. They entered cautiously, Frank's weathered face tense with confusion, Lisa's eyes red from crying. Both stopped short when they saw me behind Gerald's desk. Ms. Turner? Frank's voice wavered. They said you wanted to see us? I came around the desk, refusing to use Gerald's power position. Please sit down. There have been some changes since yesterday. I explained the situation as simply as I could. Gerald's death, the eulogy clause, my unexpected inheritance. With each revelation, their expressions shifted from wariness to disbelief. So you're saying you own the company? Now? Lisa asked, still skeptical. Controlling interest, yes, which means I get to decide who works here. I looked directly at Frank. Mr. Williams, I'd like to offer you your position back, with full benefits and a retirement package commensurate with your 25 years of service. Frank blinked rapidly, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. I don't understand. Mr. Stanton himself fired me. Mr. Stanton isn't here anymore, I said gently, and I believe in recognizing loyalty and dedication. I turned to Lisa. As for you, not only are you not fired, but I'd like to offer you a promotion. Senior accountant reporting directly to the CFO. Lisa's mouth fell open. But Mr. Delgado said, Mr. Delgado overstepped. I interrupted firmly. This is my company now, and I won't tolerate retaliatory actions against good employees. For the first time, Frank smiled, the creases around his eyes deepening. You always were different, Ms. Turner. Even when Mr. Stanton was at his worst, you treated people like people. His words hit me harder than I expected. All those years of small resistances, protecting staff when I could, softening Gerald's harshest edges, had been noticed. Will you accept the offers? I asked. Father and daughter exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Yes, ma'am, Frank said, straightening in his chair. Proud to work for you. After they left, I sat back down at Gerald's desk. No, my desk, and prepared for the company meeting. Gerald had given me 72 hours before Anthony made his move. I wasn't going to wait that long to make mine. By 4 o'clock, the company auditorium was packed. Employees from every department filled the seats, their conversations creating a nervous hum. I stood backstage, reviewing my notes one last time. Olivia found me there, giving me a quick once-over. Ready for your debut, boss? As I'll ever be, I replied, smoothing my jacket. Is Anthony here? Front row, looking like he's sucking a lemon. She squeezed my arm. Remember, most of these people are on your side. They're just waiting to see which version of leadership they're getting. I nodded, took a deep breath, and walked onto the stage. The room fell silent instantly. Hundreds of eyes fixed on me, some hopeful, some curious, some openly hostile. In the front row, Anthony sat with his arms crossed, flanked by his allies from the executive team. Good afternoon, I began, my voice steadier than I felt. For those who don't know me, I'm Megan Turner. Until yesterday, I was the operations director for North American markets. Today, I stand before you as the new CEO and majority shareholder of Stanton Enterprises. I paused, letting the reality of those words sink in, for me as much as for them. I won't pretend this transition is conventional. I won't pretend I was groomed for this role, and I certainly won't pretend that Gerald Stanton chose me because we shared the same vision for this company. A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. This wasn't the corporate speak they were expecting. In fact, I continued, I believe Gerald chose me precisely because we didn't share the same vision. Because over 10 years he saw in me someone who consistently stood for values he himself struggled to embody. Anthony shifted in his seat, his scowl deepening. Starting today, Stanton Enterprises will operate differently. We will prioritize transparency over intimidation, collaboration over competition, and most importantly, we will recognize that our greatest asset isn't our market share or our profit margins, it's our people. I outlined specific changes, an end to Gerald's practice of public humiliation as a management technique, a review of all terminations from the past year, with reinstatement for those fired without cause, new mental health benefits, and an open-door policy with executive leadership. Some will see these changes as softening our competitive edge. Acknowledged. They aren't. Treating people with dignity doesn't make a company weak. It makes it sustainable. Fear might drive short-term results, but it kills innovation, loyalty, and ultimately growth. As I spoke, I could feel the room's energy shifting, the tension easing from some shoulders. Small nods of approval, even a few tentative smiles. I know many of you are wondering if this is, real. If these changes will last. If tomorrow you'll wake up to find it was business as usual. I leaned forward slightly. I can't promise you'll never face challenges here. I can't promise we won't have hard days ahead. But I can promise you this. The era of ruling through fear is over. As long as I'm at the helm, it's not coming back. I finished to scattered applause that quickly grew, spreading across the room until most were standing. Not everyone, Anthony and his allies, remained seated, their expressions stone, but enough to know my message had landed. As I left the stage, I caught Frank Williams in the back row, applauding with tears in his eyes, his daughter beside him looking stunned but hopeful. One battle won. But as Gerald's warning echoed in my mind, I knew the war was just beginning. Anthony Delgado waited precisely 24 hours before making his first significant move against me. It came in the form of an email sent to the entire executive team and board of directors, but conspicuously not to me. Olivia forwarded it with a message of her own. The snake strikes. Thought you should see this. Anthony's email was a masterpiece of corporate undermining, cloaked in the language of concern for the company's future. He questioned my experience, my decision to dismantle successful management practices, and most pointedly, the legitimacy of my authority. While Ms. Turner's unexpected elevation makes for an interesting story, he wrote, we must ask ourselves if one man's eccentric final wishes should outweigh the stability and strategic direction of a company that employs thousands. I invite those with similar concerns to join me for a private discussion tomorrow evening. I read it twice, noting who had been included in the recipient list. Every power player in the company except my few known allies. This was Anthony gathering his forces, just as Gerald had predicted. What's your move? Olivia asked when I called her. Confront him. Directly. Fire him before he builds more support? I considered it. Gerald would have fired him instantly, making an example of him. But I wasn't Gerald. No, I decided. That would just make him a martyr. For now, we watch and wait. Who attends his meeting will tell us exactly who we're dealing with. Spy mission, Olivia said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. I know someone in IT who owes me a favor. We can get eyes and ears in that room. No illegal surveillance, I warned. But if someone happened to reserve the conference room next door and the walls happened to be thin, consider it done, boss. The next day passed in a blur of meetings and steep learning curves. I met with department heads, reviewed quarterly projections, and began the process of understanding exactly what I'd inherited. Gerald's assessment folder proved invaluable, offering insights into company politics I would have taken months to discover on my own. By evening, Olivia and I were positioned in the small conference room adjacent to where Anthony had scheduled his gathering. Through the thin wall, we could hear the voices assembling, the distinctive baritone of Walter Reynolds, the clipped tones of our CFO James Harrington, and at least a dozen others. Looks like about half the executive team showed up, Olivia whispered, peeking through a small window in our door as people filed into the neighboring room. Plus, 3 board members. Not as many as Anthony likely hoped for, but enough to cause problems. Anthony's voice came through the wall clearly as he called the meeting to order. Thank you all for coming. I know many of you share my concerns about recent developments. What followed was a systematic dismantling of my first actions as CEO, framed as reckless decisions that threaten shareholder value. He criticized the rehiring of Frank Williams, setting a dangerous precedent, my changes to the company culture, undermining accountability, and my lack of consultation with the board, bypassing established governance. The simple truth, Anthony concluded, is that Megan Turner is out of her depth. The eulogy clause was Gerald's final mistake, one we have a responsibility to correct before irreversible damage is done. Walter Reynolds spoke next, his tone measured. What exactly are you proposing, Anthony? The clause appears legally binding. Everything has a workaround, Anthony replied. Thomas Green is Gerald's man, but the company's legal team works for us. I've asked them to explore options for challenging the clause on grounds of diminished capacity. My blood ran cold. They were suggesting Gerald hadn't been mentally competent when he created the clause. That's a serious allegation, someone said. Do we have any evidence? We're gathering it, Anthony answered smoothly. Gerald's behavior became increasingly erratic in his final months. The clause itself demonstrates questionable judgment, and there are other examples we're documenting. I glanced at Olivia, whose expression mirrored my own alarm. Even if we can't overturn the clause entirely, Anthony continued, we can make Ms. Turner's position untenable. The board has the power to restrict her authority, block major initiatives, and essentially render her a figurehead until she agrees to step aside. The conversation continued, with various executives offering suggestions for how to undermine me. Some seemed enthusiastic, others more hesitant. Walter Reynolds, interestingly, remained non-committal, neither fully supporting Anthony nor defending me. After nearly an hour, the meeting adjourned with a clear plan. Anthony would lead the effort to legally challenge my position while the others would work to isolate me operationally, cutting me off from the information and resources needed to run the company effectively. When the last of them had gone, Olivia turned to me, her face grim. That was exactly what Gerald warned me about. I finished. They're moving faster than I expected. What now? They're practically staging a coup. I stood, gathering my notes. Now we prepare a countermove. The next morning, I summoned Thomas Green to my office. If anyone understood the legal foundations of my position, it would be the architect of Gerald's final clause. He arrived promptly at 9, looking as immaculate as ever. Ms. Turner, how may I assist you? Anthony Delgado is planning to challenge the eulogy clause on grounds of Gerald's diminished capacity, I said without preamble. He's rallied half the executive team and several board members. I need to know how vulnerable I am. Green's expression didn't change, but something flashed in his eyes. Appreciation for my directness, perhaps. Not vulnerable at all, he replied. Mr. Stanton anticipated this exact challenge. Of course he did, I said, unsurprised. Gerald had been playing chess while the rest of us were playing checkers, as Olivia had pointed out. The clause was written and notarized 5 years ago, when Mr. Stanton was in excellent health. Additionally, he underwent psychological evaluation by 3 independent experts annually since then, specifically to forestall any such challenge. Green allowed himself a small smile. The documentation is extensive and conclusive. Relief washed through me. So legally, my position is secure. Absolutely. However, Green cautioned, legal security doesn't prevent operational obstacles. The board does retain certain powers that could make your job difficult. They're already planning to, isolate me, restrict my authority, block my initiatives. Green nodded. A predictable strategy. May I suggest a countermeasure? Please. Transparency. He leaned forward slightly. Mr. Stanton operated in shadows, playing executives against each other, keeping information compartmentalized. It worked for him because fear filled the gaps. You don't have fear as a tool, Ms. Turner, but you have something potentially more powerful. What's that? The truth, he said simply. Bring everything into the light. Anthony's maneuvers, the board's resistance, your own vision. Take it public within the company. Most employees have more to gain from your success than from Anthony's coup. It was so contrary to how Gerald had operated that it took me a moment to see the brilliance of it. Anthony was expecting me to fight him on his terms, through backroom deals and power plays. He wasn't prepared for radical transparency. There's something else you should know, Green added. Gerald left me specific instructions to give you this if such a challenge arose. He handed me a sealed envelope. I suggest you review it privately. After Green left, I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of Gerald's stationery, containing just 3 lines. Security footage, server room B, April 15th last year. Ask Karen Mitchell about Project Helios. Remember, Anthony isn't the only shark in these waters. What was Gerald giving me? Leverage against Anthony? Against someone else? I checked the date, April 15th last year. Nothing significant came to mind. I picked up the phone and called Karen Mitchell. Karen, I need to speak with you privately. It's about Project Helios. A sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. I'll be right there. Karen arrived 10 minutes later, her usual composed demeanor visibly shaken. She closed the door carefully behind her. How do you know about Helios? She asked without sitting down. I held up Gerald's note. Gerald left me instructions to ask you about it. I'm afraid that's all I know. Karen sank into a chair, her face pale. Helios was Gerald's code name for a planned merger with Axion Technologies. It was supposed to be his crowning achievement, his legacy. I've never heard of it. No one has, except the board and a few top executives. The negotiations were conducted in absolute secrecy. What happened? The deal collapsed at the 11th hour, April of last year. She paused. Anthony Delgado happened. The date on Gerald's note suddenly made sense. April 15th. Karen nodded. Anthony was leading the technical due diligence. He secretly met with Axion's competitors and leaked proprietary information about our security systems. When Axion discovered the breach, they walked away. The merger would have doubled our market value overnight. Instead, it cost us hundreds of millions in lost opportunity and damaged relationships. Gerald knew about this? I asked, stunned. He suspected but couldn't prove it. Anthony covered his tracks well. Karen gestured to the note in my hand. Except, apparently, for whatever Gerald found in the security footage. I sat back, processing this revelation. Anthony hadn't just been undermining me. He'd been undermining the company for years, putting his own ambitions above everything else. Thank you for telling me this, Karen. She stood, smoothing her skirt with nervous hands. What are you going to do? I thought of Green's advice about transparency, about bringing everything into the light. I'm going to check the security footage, said, and then I'm going to tell the truth. The security archives were kept in a temperature-controlled room in the basement, rows of servers humming quietly in the dim blue light. I'd had to use Gerald's executive access code to enter. Another piece of foresight from a man who'd clearly anticipated this moment. Lisa Williams accompanied me, her accounting expertise valuable for navigating the, complex archiving system. Security footage is kept for 18 months, she explained as her fingers flew across the keyboard. Anything older gets purged unless specifically tagged for retention. And Gerald would have tagged this one, I murmured, watching as she pulled up the file directory. Here it is, Lisa said, pointing to a file labeled SRB 04152024GS. Server Room B, April 15th. Last year, tagged by Gerald Stanton himself. The footage loaded, showing the sterile environment of one of our secure server rooms. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then Anthony Delgado entered, looking carefully around before proceeding to a specific terminal. We watched in silence as Anthony inserted a flash drive, bypassed several security protocols using what appeared to be Gerald's own access codes, and began downloading files. "Those are the Axion merger documents," Lisa whispered, "and our proprietary security architecture. My God." The video continued, showing Anthony making a call, speaking in hushed tones. Though there was no audio, his furtive body language told the story clearly enough. This wasn't authorized access. This was corporate espionage from within. "Can you copy this footage?" I asked. Lisa nodded. "Where do you want to send it?" I thought for a moment. "Make 3 copies. One for Thomas Green, one for the board of directors, and one for me." "What are you going to do with it?" Lisa asked, her eyes wide. "Exactly what Gerald would never have done," I replied. "I'm going to bring everything into the light." The next morning, I called an emergency board meeting. Every member attended, along with the executive team. Anthony sat confidently near the head of the table, a slight smile playing at his lips. The smile of a man who believed he had the upper hand. Walter Reynolds called the meeting to order. "Ms. Turner has requested this emergency session. The floor is yours, Megan." "Thank you, Walter." I remained standing, surveying the faces around the table. "I'll be brief. It's come to my attention that there are concerns about my leadership and questions about the legitimacy of my position. Rather than address these through whispers and back channels, I've decided to bring everything into the open." Anthony's smile faltered slightly. "First, Thomas Green will address the legal standing of the eulogy clause and my position as CEO." I nodded. To Green, who distributed documents to everyone present. "The clause is ironclad," Green stated flatly. "Created 5 years ago, witnessed, notarized, and supported by extensive medical documentation of Mr. Stanton's mental competence. Any challenge would be costly, protracted, and ultimately unsuccessful." Several board members exchanged glances. Walter Reynolds studied the papers with a frown. "Second," I continued, "I want to address concerns about my leadership vision. I've distributed a comprehensive 5-year plan for Stanton Enterprises that builds on our strengths while correcting toxic elements of our culture that have been hindering growth and innovation." My team had worked through the night preparing this document, a blueprint for the company's future that respected Gerald's business acumen while correcting his human failures. "Finally," I said, reaching for the remote control on the table, "I believe it's important that we all operate with full transparency about our motivations and actions." I clicked the remote, and the large screen at the end of the room illuminated with the security footage of Anthony in the server room. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, followed by dead silence as everyone watched Anthony Delgado betraying the company for his own gain. Anthony shot to his feet. This is taken out of context. I was authorized." "By whom?" I interrupted calmly. "Not by Gerald Stanton. I have his complete access logs for that period. Not by the board, whose minutes show no such authorization. And certainly not by Axion Technologies, whose CEO confirms you contacted their competitor the very next day." The color drained from Anthony's face. "The collapse of the Axion merger cost this company hundreds of millions in potential growth," I continued. "It damaged our reputation in the tech sector and destroyed what Gerald considered his legacy project." Walter Reynolds looked thunderstruck. "You knew about this, Delgado?" "It's not what it looks like," Anthony protested, his confident facade crumbling. "The Axion deal was flawed. I was protecting Stanton Enterprises. By selling our proprietary security architecture to the highest bidder?" I shook my head. "The evidence suggests otherwise." The room erupted in angry questions directed at Anthony, whose responses grew increasingly desperate and contradictory. The tide had turned. So quickly it was almost dizzying. I raised my hand for silence, and gradually the room quieted. "I didn't call this meeting to conduct a trial," I said. "Nor am I here to enact some kind of retribution. What's done is done, but I do believe in accountability." I looked directly at Anthony. "Mr. Delgado, your employment with Stanton Enterprises is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings." Anthony's face contorted with rage. "You can't do this. The board won't." "The board fully supports Ms. Turner's decision," Walter Reynolds interrupted, surprising me. He turned to Anthony with undisguised disgust. "You betrayed Gerald. You betrayed all of us." As security led a shell-shocked Anthony from the room, I addressed the remaining executives and board members. "I understand many of you have doubts about my vision for this company. You're entitled to those doubts. I haven't earned your trust yet, but I intend to." I closed my folder of notes. "I'm not Gerald Stanton. I won't rule through fear and manipulation. But make no mistake, I will protect this company and its people with every tool at my disposal. Walter Reynolds cleared his throat. I think I speak for the board when I say we may have misjudged the situation. Your handling of this matter shows a level of leadership we perhaps didn't anticipate. It wasn't a full endorsement, but it was a start. As the meeting adjourned, executives approached me one by one, some offering tentative support, others merely taking my measure with new eyes. The balance of, power had shifted dramatically in the span of an hour. Olivia found me afterward, grinning widely. That, she declared, was magnificent. Anthony's face when the video started playing, I wish I'd taken a picture. I smiled, but the victory felt hollow in some ways. I didn't want it to happen like this, Olivia. Exposing someone's worst moment in front of their colleagues, it feels like something Gerald would have done. The difference, she said firmly, is that Gerald would have enjoyed it. You didn't. And you didn't do it for sport or dominance. You did it because the company needed the truth. Her words comforted me, but as I walked back to my office, I couldn't help wondering, in fighting monsters, how careful did I need to be to avoid becoming one myself? The weeks that followed were transformative. With Anthony gone and the board cautiously aligned behind me, I was able to implement changes that began healing the company culture Gerald had poisoned for so long. Frank Williams was reinstated with a ceremony acknowledging his years of service. Karen Mitchell led a comprehensive review of HR policies, eliminating the punitive practices that had kept employees in constant fear. Olivia was promoted to Chief Marketing Officer, bringing fresh energy to a department that had stagnated under Gerald's micromanagement. Most importantly, I established regular town halls where employees at all levels could speak directly to leadership without fear of reprisal. The first session was tentative, with few willing to believe the change was genuine. By the third, we had to move to the auditorium to accommodate everyone who wanted to participate. 1 month after Gerald's death, I finally had maintenance clear my office, replacing the imposing mahogany desk with a more collaborative setup, adding plants, natural light, photographs of company events and milestones. As the physical space transformed, so too did the company's atmosphere. People smiled in the hallways. Innovation, that had been stifled for years, began flowing again. Productivity improved as fear receded. Not everything was smooth sailing. Some executives from the old guard resigned rather than adapt. Clients accustomed to Gerald's hardball tactics needed reassurance that our new approach wouldn't affect quality or deliverables. The board remained vigilant, watching for any misstep that might validate their initial doubts. But gradually, inexorably, Stanton Enterprises was becoming something new, something better. Through it all, I kept Gerald's handwritten letter in my desk drawer, occasionally rereading his final instructions. Do with my empire what I could not. Make it respected. Was that what he'd truly wanted? Or had his final test been designed to show that power inevitably corrupts? That I would eventually adopt his methods despite my best intentions? I still didn't know, but I was determined to prove that strength didn't require cruelty, that leadership could inspire rather than intimidate. And somewhere, I like to think Gerald Stanton was watching, perhaps learning a final lesson from the little secretary he'd underestimated for so long. 6 months after inheriting Stanton Enterprises, I found myself back in the boardroom where it had all begun, delivering a very different kind of speech. Our quarterly results had exceeded expectations, with employee retention up 20% and innovation metrics at a 5-year high. The shareholders were pleased. The board was cautiously optimistic, and I was finally beginning to feel like the title of CEO belonged to me, not just to Gerald's ghost. The numbers tell part of the story, I concluded, but they don't capture the fundamental shift in who we are as a company. We're not just performing better. We're performing better because our people are empowered, engaged, and invested in outcomes they help shape. Walter Reynolds, who had become an unlikely ally over the months, nodded appreciatively. Impressive. Results, Megan. Gerald would be... He trailed off, perhaps realizing the contradiction. Gerald would be what? Proud? Hardly. Satisfied? Maybe. Surprised? Definitely. Thank you, Walter, I said, filling the awkward silence. I believe in building on Gerald's business vision while creating a culture where that vision can thrive sustainably. After the meeting adjourned, Thomas Green approached me. In the months since Gerald's death, he had continued serving as my legal advisor, his precise mind and institutional knowledge proving invaluable. Ms. Turner, do you have a moment? He asked. There's something I've been instructed to give you today. My stomach tightened. Another message from beyond the grave? Gerald again? Green nodded. He was very specific about the timing. 6 months. After transition, regardless of outcomes. In my office, Green handed me another sealed envelope, this one thicker than the last. "I'll leave you to review it privately," he said, closing the door behind him. I stared at the envelope for several minutes before finding the courage to open it. Inside was a substantial document and another handwritten note from Gerald. "Megan, if you're reading this, you've survived 6 months as CEO. Whether you've succeeded or failed, maintained your principles or abandoned them, is immaterial to what follows. Enclosed, you'll find my personal shares in Ventress Medical, 27% ownership of a company that recently received FDA approval for a revolutionary cancer treatment. These shares are not part of Stanton Enterprises and were never included in company. Disclosures. Their current value exceeds $300 million. They are yours, with no strings attached. Sell them, keep them, donate them. I don't care. Consider it compensation for 10 years of psychological warfare. You're wondering why. The truth is disappointingly simple. Because you earned it. Not by passing my test, but by enduring a decade of what no one should have had to endure. By protecting others when you could. By maintaining your humanity when I had lost mine. I was not a good man, Megan. I knew it and did nothing to change it. Perhaps that is the true failure of leadership. Not insufficient profit or growth, but the failure to evolve beyond one's worst instincts. Do better than I did. Gerald." I sat back, stunned. $300 million. A fortune separate from the company, with no oversight, no responsibilities attached. Financial independence? Freedom. My phone buzzed with a text from Olivia. "Everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost from your office window." I smiled, tucking the papers into my desk drawer. "I'm fine. Meet for lunch? I have something to discuss." The cancer center at New York Presbyterian Hospital wasn't where most people would choose to spend a beautiful spring afternoon, but as I walked its hallways 6 weeks later, I felt a sense of rightness that had been building since reading Gerald's final letter. Dr. Sarah Chen, the hospital's chief oncologist, led me through the newly renovated pediatric wing, where bright murals and state-of-the-art equipment created an environment that softened the harsh reality of childhood cancer. "The Stanton Turner Foundation's donation is already making a difference," she explained, gesturing to a young boy receiving treatment while playing a video game. "We've enrolled 32 children in the Ventress treatment protocol who wouldn't have qualified under insurance restrictions." I nodded, watching the boy laugh at something on his screen, momentarily free from the burden of his illness. "And the adult program? 117 patients so far, with a 74% response rate." Dr. Chen's eyes shone with controlled excitement. "These are people who had exhausted all other options, Ms. Turner. You're quite literally giving them time they wouldn't have had." The Stanton Turner Foundation had been my response to Gerald's unexpected gift, a way to transform his money into something healing rather than controlling. I'd kept enough shares to maintain a voice in Ventress's ethical practices, but directed the bulk of the value into funding access to treatments for those who couldn't afford them. Gerald's name was on the foundation alongside mine, not to honor him, but to acknowledge the complex truth of how this good had come from his lifetime of hard choices and harder methods. As I left the hospital, my phone rang. It was Frank Williams. "Ms. Turner." His warm voice greeted me. "Just calling to confirm you're still coming to Lisa's engagement party on Saturday?" "I wouldn't miss it, Frank. And please, after all this time, it's just Megan." He chuckled. "Old habits. Lisa says to remind you it's casual. No CEO outfits allowed. Jeans and a t-shirt it is." We chatted for a few minutes about company matters. Frank now headed a newly created employee advocacy department, before saying goodbye. These personal connections, once forbidden under Gerald's regime, had become the lifeblood of the transformed Stanton Enterprises. Back at the office, I found Karen waiting with the final draft of our new parental leave policy. 16 weeks fully. Paid, among the most generous in the industry. "The board approved it unanimously," she reported, unable to keep the satisfaction from her voice. "Walter says it's exactly the kind of policy that sets us apart from competitors." "That's Walter speak for good job." I laughed. "He's coming around," Karen said. "They all are. It's hard to argue with success." After she left, I walked to the window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline as the afternoon sun gilded the glass towers. Somewhere out there, hundreds of people were receiving cancer treatments they couldn't otherwise afford. In this very building, employees were working without the shadow of fear Gerald had cast for so long. Was this what he'd wanted all along? Had the final test been his way of forcing change he couldn't bring himself to implement? I would never know for certain. Gerald Stanton had taken his true motivations to the grave, leaving me with a complex inheritance, a company, a fortune, and the freedom to define what legacy really meant. In my desk drawer, his letters remained, reminders of where we'd started and how far we'd come. I no longer read them. Their power over me had diminished as I'd grown into my role, making choices based on my values rather than reactions to his. That evening, as I prepared to leave, Olivia appeared in my doorway. "Drinks?" she suggested. "A bunch of us are heading to O'Malley's to celebrate the new parental leave policy. Even some of the old guard are coming." 6 months ago, such a gathering would have been unthinkable. Executives and staff socializing as equals, celebrating a policy Gerald would have mocked as weakness. "I'd love to," I said, grabbing my jacket. As we walked out together, Olivia nudged my shoulder. "You know, I was thinking about that day. The memorial, when you stood up and said all those nice things about Gerald that weren't true. What about it? Maybe they weren't all lies," she mused. "You said he was visionary, in a twisted way. He saw something in you that no one else did. Maybe not even yourself." I considered this as we waited for the elevator. Perhaps. Or maybe he just wanted to cause chaos from beyond the grave. "Either way," Olivia said as the doors opened, "the punchline is pretty satisfying. The man who ruled through fear is now funding cancer treatments for children. There's a certain poetic justice in that." I smiled, thinking of Gerald's final words to me. "Do better than I did." "It's not about justice," I said as we stepped into the elevator. "It's about the legacy we choose to build from what we're given, even when what we're given comes from difficult people and painful experiences." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "That's very philosophical for a Thursday evening." I laughed. "You're right. Let's go celebrate with the team." As the elevator doors closed, I left behind the ghost of Gerald Stanton and the weight of his complicated bequest. The company was flourishing, lives were being saved, and I had found my voice, not as Gerald's chosen successor, not as the reluctant inheritor of his empire, but as the architect of something new and better. In the end, that was the true inheritance. Not the power he'd given me, but the power I'd found within myself to transform his legacy into something worthy of respect. And that was a legacy I could live with.